Good morning. I am very pleased and honored to introduce to you Rhoda Olken. Dr. Olken is a full... Oh, so it's just me. Okay, I can't blame it on the technology. Sorry about that. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Rhoda Olken. Dr. Olken is full professor at the California School of Professional Psychology. She is on staff at The Looking Glass, which is a nonprofit organization serving families with disabilities, and a national resource center on parents with disabilities. She is the recipient of a grant currently from the Department of Education. She has founded the handicap services at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She has agreed to work with the summit organizers next time around in order to make this a more user-friendly environment for people with physical challenges. She has written a book very recently that has just come out. There it is. It is titled, What Psychotherapists Should Know About Disabilities. It is my pleasure to give to you Dr. Rhoda Olken.
It's always a little embarrassing how much I have to lower the microphone. I've asked the videographer to make me look tall. I'm going to start this morning reading briefly from the preface of my book, because I figured even if you ran out and bought the book, which of course you should do, you won't read the preface. So I'm going to begin with that. I am bicultural. I live in two worlds, the non-disabled majority and my minority group's world of the disability community. One is the world of stairs, ab rollers, fishing, careers, mountain climbing. The other of crips, gimps, retards, and spazzes. Guess where I feel more at home? In the disability community, we refer to people without disabilities as ABs, able-bodied, or TABs, temporarily able-bodied. Notice the vantage point, non-disabled, not like us. We don't call them normals because to us they are not the norm. In our world, abnormal is normal. Take Nick, for instance. Nick's the kind of guy people automatically avoid. Mothers jerk their children back as they pass him in the street. Don't point, dear, shh. Nick uses an electric wheelchair. His limbs go in the wrong direction, as if not attached properly, and his hands are at odd angles. His face seems to grimace for no reason, and his tongue is all too much in evidence. When he speaks, the contortions and gyrations extend from head top to toes, and the words are mangled, swallowed, expectorated, some of them intelligible, others obscured by the process of expulsion. I know a lot of guys like Nick. This book is only superficially about Nick, because Nick is fine. He's a lawyer, he has friends, he has quality of life. Nick's main problem is ABs. The counselor who told Nick's mother that she had to, quote, grieve the loss of the normal child she did not have before she could learn to love Nick. The doctor who worked on Nick's limbs, oblivious to the fact that they were attached to a whole body, much less a whole person. The mother who assured Nick that he could grow up to be whatever he wanted to be, even when Nick wanted to be a football player. The colleges that refused to let him enroll, and the law schools that wouldn't even send him an application. The father who didn't want him to marry his daughter, the therapist who told him he had a chip on his shoulder. People, really well-meaning, perfectly nice people, use words to describe Nick such as resilient, brave, adaptable, plucky, courageous. Courage requires options. Where is it written that we get options? I'd like you to keep Nick in mind as I talk this morning about disability issues. If I could have the first overhead. I was thinking yesterday about stereotype threat, and I was wondering, what's the stereotype about people with disabilities? So I decided one of them is that we have no sense of humor, feminists and people with disabilities. So I thought I'd start with a cartoon, which is a picture of the pearly gates, and in front of the pearly gates there are two parking spaces. The second best one goes to God, but the best one goes to handicap parking. The second cartoon is a picture of a man on a scooter riding through the aisles of what looks like a Safeway, and behind him is the specter of death also riding a scooter. And I had this cartoon up at work until someone wrote my name above the specter of death. And I decided it was a dissertation student and it was time to take it down. Next overhead. I'm not going to do the bottom one. That's enough humor. Now I've established that I have a sense of humor. Okay. I'm going to talk today about 5 different areas. First, 3 models of disability: the moral model, the medical model, and the social model. And then establish that disability is in fact a minority, and the similarities and some very key differences from other types of minority status. Third, the language that gets used to describe disability. Fourth, APA and APA accredited programs and some data that comes out of that. And then lastly, key issues in the disability community. There are 53 million persons with disabilities in the United States. That's approximately 15% of the population, which means that people with disabilities are the largest minority group in America. The 3rd most common language in America is American Sign Language, second only to English and Spanish. Disabilities occur disproportionately to Native Americans and African Americans. Next most common in jockeying order are Hispanics and Caucasians, and often lower than that is Asian Americans. Next overhead. I'm going to talk about 3 models of disability. The first model is the moral model. I'm going to go over the same areas for each of the different models so that you can see the contrast among them. First, the meaning of disability. In the moral model, the meaning of disability is that it's a defect caused by moral lapse or sin. It's the reification of sin or a failure of faith or a moral lapse or evil or a test of faith. There is often the myth that as disability impairs one sense, it heightens another. We see this in Greek mythology. All the oracles are always blind. The moral implications of the moral model are that it brings terrible shame to the person with the disability and his or her family. Cultures that tend to emphasize group and community over individual ascribe more to the moral model. Some sample ideas from the moral model are that God only gives us that which we can bear, or God is testing us. And an example comes from a catalog, a current catalog called Signals, which is, I think, by National Public Radio. They sell a Gaelic plaque which has the following quote on it: "May those who love us, and those that don't love us, may God turn their hearts, and if he doesn't turn their hearts, may he turn their ankles, so we'll know them by their limping." This is a very common idea in movies, that people with disabilities become the reification of evil in the movie. The origin of the model, this is the oldest of the 3 models by far, but surprisingly it's still the most prevalent worldwide. The goals of intervention in the moral model are faith and forbearance, or the learning or lessons that one gains from disability. The benefits of the moral model: there's some acceptance of having been selected to have a disability, a feeling of a relationship with God, a sense of greater purpose to having a disability in the family. The negative effects are the sense of shame, the being ostracized, perhaps from family, perhaps from community, the profound shame, and having to hide the symptoms, and sometimes even the entire person with the disability. The kinds of things clinically that you might hear from a mother, for example, who had a child with a disability. The mother might say something like, "There's a reason we were given this child." Let's go on to the medical model. The meaning of disability in the medical model is that disability is a medical problem that resides in the individual. It is a defect or a failure of a bodily system and is inherently abnormal or pathological. The moral implications of the medical model: this model repudiates the view of disability as a lesion on the soul, and instead there may be blame to the person or the family for healthcare habits. This starts innocuously enough. Your mother says to you, "Don't go out without a sweater, you're going to catch a cold." And then we go to type A personalities are more likely to have heart attacks, and then unprotected sex is more likely to lead to AIDS. And the next thing you know, we're down this slippery slope where people with disabilities have incurred some responsibility for the fact that they have a disability. Sample ideas in the medical model. Patients are described clinically. For example, you might say this is a person with left hemiplegia and some spasticity in his left arm. Or there is an incomplete lesion at the C4 level. So the terminology becomes medical. The origins of the medical model were in the mid-1800s. This is by far the most common model of disability in the United States, and it's mostly the medical model that drives rehab psychology. The goals of intervention here are cure, or at least amelioration of the physical condition to the greatest extent possible. Rehabilitation is the adjustment of the person with the condition to the condition and to the environment. I'm going to repeat that because I'm going to contrast it with the social model. It's the adjustment of the person to the condition and the person to the environment. Patients or clients are expected to avail themselves of the variety of services that are offered to them by trained professionals, mostly AB professionals, able-bodied. The benefits of the medical model are lessened sense of shame. It promotes faith in the medical intervention. You have a defined patient role. It spurs medical and technological advances that have indeed improved the lives of people with disabilities. The negative effects, it's a very paternalistic system. There is an isolation of body parts, a failure to integrate disability into the whole of the person and the person's identity. It is seen as inherently abnormal, and mostly it's about doing things to people with disabilities, not with people with disabilities. I turn now to the social model of disability. Disability is a social construct. Do I have a disability? Only in certain situations. If I can't get up the stairs and I need the ramp, yes, I have a disability. As I stand here now, my disability is less of a salient feature. I have a disability in some circumstances and not in others. If I had a job where I had to stand on my feet all day, I would have a disability and be unable to perform the job. As a professor, it's less of a relevant factor. Disability is a social construct. The problems lie in the environment that fails to accommodate people with disabilities. People with disabilities are a minority group that has been denied its civil rights, equal access, and protection. The key impediments for people with disabilities are prejudice, stigma, and discrimination, social isolation, unequal treatment, economic dependence, high unemployment, inferior housing, and higher rates of institution. Notice that none of those are about the person with the disability, him or herself. The moral implications of the social model is that society has failed a segment of its citizens. Sample ideas, borrowing shamelessly from South African anti-apartheid movement, nothing about us without us. And my favorite, since I had polio and the March of Dimes paid for my hospitalization, and now the new poster, which I have up in my house, is, "You gave us your dimes, now give us our rights." The origins of the social model were mostly in the early 1900s, and then it all but disappeared for over about 50 years, until about 1975. The impetus was that in 1973, Congress passed the Rehab Act, but the Rehab Act had not yet been signed by the president, and therefore had not yet been enacted. For the first time on national television, there were groups of protesters with disabilities in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., on the evening news. There were sit-ins in both cities. In Washington, D.C., they turned off the lights and the water and everybody went home within a day or two. In San Francisco, where we know how to do protests, Safeway brought food, people brought portable showers, the Black Panthers brought food and cots, and they stayed and were on the evening news night after night. resulting in the signing of the Rehab Act, and really the beginning of the modern civil rights movement for people with disabilities. The leadership that is currently in the disability community is still people who remember or were participants in that protest in 1975. And now the movement is led not just for people with disabilities, but by people with disabilities. The goals of intervention in the social model are political, policy, economic, and social systems, increased accessibility of places and of services. The benefits of the social model are the integration of the disability into the self and the self-concept, a focus on the way the world disadvantages people with disabilities, and a sense of belonging and involvement in a disability community. Disability pride. The negative effects. If you think that what you have to change is merely the main social and economic policies of the country, this is a little bit more overwhelming than looking inside oneself. And so there can be a sense of despair or of being overwhelmed. Or, in the words of one of my clients, I will not be a victim, where he felt too overwhelmed by these larger issues and was more content to look at what he might change about himself. There's also a need for very strong self-advocacy skills to be a disability rights advocate. In therapy with people with disabilities, I believe very strongly and argue in my book that the therapist should hold the social model of disability. However, I do not believe that the client must hold the social model of disability. I think that your goal in therapy with people with disabilities is to help them maximize the benefits of their model and minimize its negative impact, not to convert them all to the social model of disability. I'd like to turn now to some of the similarities and some of the key differences between disability and other minority groups, starting with the similarities. This should sound very, very familiar to you. First, disability is a minority group, and the key features of any minority group are prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. There are daily reminders of minority status. Identifiability, differential power, differential and pejorative treatment, and group awareness. Since about the mid-'80s, a Harris poll has been periodically asking people with disabilities the following question: do you think of yourself as a person with a disability, as a member of a minority group, much the way African Americans and Hispanics are members of minority groups? And the percentage of people saying yes to that question has steadily increased, till now about 76% of people with disabilities think of themselves as a member of a minority group. This is a real change in self-perception. Secondly, there's tremendous pressure to assimilate, to emulate the majority culture. Third, there's an inferior status is attributed to inherent traits of people with disabilities, a confusion of biology with the results of social oppression. Fourth, there are concerns about whether people with disabilities should procreate, especially people with cognitive or developmental disabilities, and issues of marriage, intermarriage, should you marry within your own kind or outside your own kind. Hate crimes, though disability was the last to be added to the Hate Crimes Act. And I think it's not just hate crimes against people with disabilities, but more it's a rather steady menu of harassment of people with disabilities. For example, I'll be in a mall and some teenagers will decide to play sport by blocking my scooters so that I cannot leave. Really a mistake on their part, because I would not hesitate in the least to run them over. So. Number 7 is a lack of standardized testing or problems in the representation of groups that are used to norm tests, lack of appropriate instruments, inappropriate use of tests, and inappropriate interpretations of tests. For example, if you had a page that was in a table, the entire page was one table, to translate that into an oral version is more than just simply reading it out loud. There's much more of a profound change in going from a written visual version to an oral version. Tests that are predominantly English-based cannot well be translated into American Sign Language. All their testing is the deaf person's facility with English and not the underlying construct of the test. Number 8 You are always seen as being a representative of your group. You speak for your people, which I don't mind doing. It's okay. You have to excel to be considered as good as everyone else. Your acts are always interpreted as representative of others of your kind. 9, there's a profound lack of role models. Kids grow up in isolation without exposure to other people with disabilities, much less people like themselves. 10, there's a lack of people represented with disabilities in the professions, particularly in mental health and in medicine. There's actually a slight overrepresentation of people with disabilities in law. Approximately, we heard the statistic yesterday, about 6% of APA membership is ethnic minorities, under 2% is people with disabilities. Mental health services, this is a group that's vastly underserved. An example is that I was seeing a woman in a wheelchair with quadriplegia who had a profound eating disorder and was losing weight as she sat in front of me. And I tried to find somebody who had expertise in anorexia, who was wheelchair accessible, and I was unable to find someone in the greater Walnut Creek, Concord area. 12, underrepresentation in politics, which means that few people with disabilities hold public office, but also that there is an absence of disability issues in the public discourse. 13, there's a high actual and perceived risk for people with disabilities. There are higher school dropout rates for children with disabilities. The substance abuse rate is estimated to be about 26% among people with disabilities, and for the general population is about 10%. Unemployment for people with moderate to severe disabilities, and by the way, the government considers me to have a moderate to severe disability, 76% are unemployed. That figure has been remarkably immune to civil rights laws and any other kinds of laws that have been passed for people with disabilities in the last 25 years. And lastly, I believe that minorities have prescriptions and proscriptions on what is allowable affect, and in particular, they are not allowed to be angry. I will say more about that in a little while. I'd also like to go now to the differences between disability and other minority groups. And actually, what you'll notice is that there's quite a bit of overlap with gay, lesbian, and bisexuals in this list. The first, and I think the most important, has to do with the notion of separate but equal. In 1954, in the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, a basic doctrine was laid down that separate is not equal. But I have separate buses, separate water fountains, separate entrances, separate transportation systems. If my faculty were to meet at the UC Berkeley Faculty Center, UC Berkeley being the heart and home of the independent living movement, I would have to enter around the back, behind the garbage cans and through the kitchen. There is no other group for whom that would be acceptable. Secondly, you grow up in isolation from other people with disabilities. Your family often has no one else with a disability in it, certainly no one else with your kind of disability. There's no one in your neighborhood. There's no one in your school. There's no one in your community. So there's a tremendous isolation. Third, we have open enrollment. You're welcome to join us at any time, and you can in the blink of an eye. So minority status can be conferred after birth. And although I talk about disability pride as part of the social model, come on, say it with me. Say it loud, I'm crippled and proud. It just doesn't have the same ring to it as some of the other groups. Fifth, there's always the question with disability, whose fault is it? And there's lots of studies in social psychology about people's need to see the world as a fair place and ways in which we do cognitive gyrations to distance ourselves from the issue of disability so that we protect ourselves from the idea that it could happen to us. But the result is that people with disabilities are often blamed for their own condition, and the more severe their disability is, the more they tend to be blamed for it. Sixth, there's a realm of discrimination that occurs at every single level of the person's life. It is not just in employment and housing and in the way people treat you. It's in phones and in stares and in shopping malls and in employment and in movies and in restaurants and in bathrooms and in water fountains and in sidewalks. It's everywhere in every facet of your life. Seventh, this is a minority community that is less well organized than other minority communities. There are many people who have really no access to a disability community unless they live in one of the larger cities. Eighth, there's tremendous disadvantage, as I've talked about before, with under and unemployment, and wages are lower for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities in comparable jobs. Number 9, I'm going to skip because we've talked about it. Number 10, the body is not a reflection of yourself. What I mean here is that a physical disability can change the way that your body moves and interacts. Take Nick. Remember Nick? His whole body is involved in talking. If you are trying to look for nonverbal cues from Nick, his body is sending messages that have different meaning than they would in an able-bodied person. I'm reminded of the movie Breathing Lessons, which won an Academy Award about 2 years ago. It's about a poet named Mark O'Brien, who spends 23 out of 24 hours in an iron lung. Mark O'Brien said, "I am not my body." The irony here is that psychology, particularly health psychology, is very busy trying to integrate back together mind and body, while people with disabilities are saying, "Do not judge me by my body. I am not my body." 11, people with disabilities spend much more time being helped by professionals. They spend a disproportionate amount of their time in settings where they have low status or where the characteristics of the setting connote inferiority. It is estimated that people with disabilities have no fewer than 12 professionals involved in their care. I thought this was ridiculous, but was able to come up with the names of 12 people in under 3 minutes. 12th, there is often an option to disclose or not disclose a disability. If it's a hidden disability, and if it's a visible disability, there's an option to bring it up or not to bring it up, particularly in interviews. 13, we would probably, I hope, notice if we went to a movie and everyone at the movie was white. But if we go to a movie and there's nobody there with a visible disability, we probably wouldn't think about it. What we notice is if there is someone there in a wheelchair. It's our presence, not our absence, that is noticed. We are called the hidden minority for that reason. 14th, disability is expensive. It's expensive to the person with a disability, and it can be expensive to the employer or the school for providing accommodations. Not as expensive as employers think, though. Approximately 75% of all modifications cost $500 and less. Disability is time-consuming. If I go somewhere and my scooter breaks down, suddenly the day becomes not about an outing with my daughter, but about how I'm going to get out of this predicament. Things take extra time. In part because of number 15, the disability triad is pain, fatigue, and weakness, and these require management. This means that a piece of me is always thinking about these things and monitoring them. It's as if a little bit of RAM is taken up with a big program and a little bit less is available to run other programs. And 16th, just like there is a prohibition against anger, there's actually a prescription for how we ought to feel. And this comes from FDR. Hugh Gallagher wrote a book called FDR's Grand Deception, and he did a biography of FDR focusing on FDR's disability. And he says that FDR made a bargain with the country. The bargain was this: we, the people, will let you, the President of the United States, be out and about among us. We will let people with disabilities be in our society on 2 conditions. One is that you endeavor at all times to be cheerful, and 2, that you do not make us unduly aware of your disability. And certainly, FDR did not make the country unduly aware of his disability. It is only now about 5 years after the FDR Memorial went up in Washington, D.C., that they have just unveiled a sculpture of FDR in his wheelchair. If you think of FDR, the image of him is with his head thrown back and the long cigarette holder and this huge grin on his face. That's the cheerfulness. People with disabilities are supposed to be plucky. Next time you read a story in the newspaper, what I call the plucky little disabled person story, they appear about every 3 months in most local newspapers. You will see that they talk about the person as being very heroic and very plucky just for getting up in the morning. You will look for words like courage and lucky and plucky. And lastly, disability requires extra tasks. Nothing can be taken for granted. I can't go to a new restaurant without calling ahead to see if they're accessible. And then when they tell me they are, I can't count on the fact that not only will the restaurant be accessible, but the bathrooms will be accessible. I could get stuck anywhere. When I checked into the hotel and found out my room was on the second floor, they also handed me a sheet of paper saying that we were very likely to have a power outage. So now the whole conference, a little piece of me is wondering, would they really come and get me if I got stuck in the elevator, or would they just let me sit there? How long would it take them to notice I was missing? Hopefully by this morning we would have figured it out. So I was glad to be on the panel, actually. If we could turn to the next overhead about language. There's been an evolution of language used to describe people with disabilities. For a long time it was crippled or cripples. For example, the Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children. And then we became the handicapped, or the retarded, or the schizophrenic. So the condition was used to define the totality of the person. Around the 70s, there was a movement towards what's called people first language, people with disabilities, people with fill in the blank, people with polio, people with cerebral palsy, people with learning disabilities. And in fact, this is the language that APA requires, people first language, in all publications according to APA style. Of course, the irony is now that APA is caught up with that, we've moved on. And England, for a long time, has said, this is nonsense, this people first language, or disabled people, just call it that. And now in the United States, there's a bit of movement towards the language of disabled people, because if disability is a social construct, and so disability is mostly about oppression, do you say people with oppression? No, you say oppressed people. So saying disabled people is saying people who are oppressed because of their disability. So there's been a movement back towards the language of disabled people. However, we still use people with to describe specific conditions, people with developmental disabilities, for example. I'd like to read some examples of how language gets used. I'm going to describe a man named Joe, and I'm going to describe him 3 times, and nothing about him has changed, and nothing in the description is different in terms of what he is doing. The only thing that's different is the language used to describe him. In this first example, after Joe drives home from work, he goes into the living room for 10 minutes to rest and read the newspaper. Then he prepares dinner. The family sits down to eat together at 6 and discusses the events of the day. In this description, Joe is described as an ordinary family man performing daily tasks and interacting with his family. His disability is not mentioned because it is irrelevant to the tasks that are discussed. The second description is probably one that's more reflective of the medical model. After Joe drives home from work in his van with hand controls, he sits in his wheelchair in the living room for 10 minutes to rest and read the newspaper. Due to difficulties from cerebral palsy with fine motor coordination, Joe has trouble holding the paper, so he lays it out on a lap desk to read. After 10 minutes, Joe prepares dinner using specially shaped knives and pots with extra handles. The family sits down to eat together at 6. Joe uses a special plate with a lip to push food against, and L-shaped utensils that are easier to grab. The family discusses the events of the day. The children are used to their father's speech, which has reduced enunciation, and are readily able to understand him. In that description, disability is mentioned, but in a fairly neutral language, and we learn information about the modifications that Joe uses. The perspective is on the availability of assistive devices. We might think that it's nice that such things are available, and it becomes clear that assistive devices increase the independence of people with disabilities. In telling about Joe's speech, the focus is on the children's ability to understand him rather than on Joe's ability to speak. This third example is the one you'll read in your local newspaper. Joe, who was wheelchair-bound since he was afflicted with cerebral palsy at birth, drives home from work in his altered van, which has specially installed hand controls and a floor lower than normal vans to accommodate his height from a wheelchair. He parks in the garage at home and slowly lowers the van lift, then laboriously makes his way out of the van and up a ramp to the house. Then he must rest for at least 10 minutes from fatigue due to his disorder. He is able to read the paper only with the use of a lap desk on which to rest it because his deformed fingers cannot hold the pages. After his rest, he wheels into the kitchen to prepare dinner. Special utensils and pots with odd-shaped handles allow people like Joe to do simple daily tasks in the kitchen. The family sits down to eat together at 6. Joe must use a special plate with a lip to push food against, and special utensils with altered shapes which are easier to grab. The family discusses the events of the day. Joe is able to converse with his children even though he suffers from a speech impediment that reduces his enunciation and ability to make himself understood. I think the issue is not whether we call Joe a man with cerebral palsy or a disabled person. I think the issue is the other kind of language that we've used to describe his life. Okay, and now for something completely different. This is kind of like Haydn's Surprise Symphony. You know, in the middle, you got to make a switch to keep the audience on their toes. So I'm going to switch to something completely different. We'll see if we can bring the two themes back together at the end. I'm going to talk now about a study that I did twice, one in 1989 and one in 1999, where I surveyed all APA-accredited clinical and counseling programs in the U.S. In 1989, this was a year before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and obviously in 1999, 9 years after its passage. And one of the questions of interest was, were there required courses in the APA-accredited program? In 1989, 76% of the programs had no course on disability in the program. In 1999, 89% had no course on disability in the required program. For those few places, the 11% of the places that did have a required course on disability, the content of the course was most likely to be on one of three areas: exceptional children, mental retardation or developmental disabilities, and children with learning disabilities or language disorders. A couple of things are important about these three courses. One is that they're always on children. When we think about people with disabilities, we tend to think about children with disabilities. If you do a literature search on people with disabilities, what you find is that families with disabilities is code for families with children with disabilities. I know this because my particular area of interest has been parents with disabilities, and that literature is very difficult to find, and I eagerly look for the families with disabilities literature and always find that it's about children. It's as if children have disabilities and then disappear off the face of the earth. Secondly, these three courses are ones that are much more likely to ascribe to the medical model of disability. Out of approximately 210 programs, APA-accredited programs, there were only 7 courses that reflect the social model of disability in the country. One of the reasons this is an issue is if we have under 2% of people with disabilities in APA, and remember they're 15% of the population, then how are we going to attract students with disabilities to the field? Now, this is not to say that students with disabilities only want to come to study disability. However, we do know that students want to come to a place where they will feel welcome. And when they do not see themselves reflected anywhere in the curriculum, they do not feel welcome. When they see that we have socio-cultural diversity classes that do not include disability, they do not feel welcome. I'm going to switch to a second study that we did at CSPP in Alameda, as yet to be published. This was a survey of all of the practicum and internship sites that our students go to, approximately 120 sites in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. We got a response rate of 46% with the single mailing and no follow-up. We're now doing the follow-up, but a 46% rate was not bad for a single mailing. What we found is that 70% of the placements had no employees and no students with disabilities, physical or sensory, in the past 3 years. That about 50% of the practicum and internship sites had a secondary site that students were required to attend, and that the secondary sites were much less likely to be accessible than were the primary sites. This is a problem because the students go for the interview at the primary site and check out the accessibility and then take the practicum and then find that there's a whole other site that's completely inaccessible. Third, about half the sites had at least one floor that they used that was not accessible by an elevator. 20% lacked handicap parking, 25% had no ramps, 81% did not have an automatic door opener, and although outside doors were likely to be 36 inches, which is the required width, inside doors were much less likely to be 32 inches, the required width. Those four things are very important because the ADA set priorities, and the very first priority was to get people with disabilities into the building. These are issues about people just getting into the building, not about accessibility of services and of training and of supervision. Eighth, access was really particularly poor for people with sensory disabilities. Only 16% had any Braille signage in the building. Only 38% had emergency alarms that had both visible and audible warnings. Only 12% had elevators with Braille and audible signals. And 78% had no TTY, a teletype line, also known as TDD, telecommunication device for the deaf. And even less listed their TTY on any of their letterheads. So what good is having a TTY if no one knows its number? I'm going to move now from this to what I think are really the key issues in the disability community that psychology can play a key role in. One is we have to get more students with disabilities into the programs. At Alameda, we have approximately 52 students out of maybe 550 who are students with disabilities. Of those 52, over half of them have been referred to the committee that looks at students who are having problems in the program. We're bouncing a lot of students out of the program. So we not only have to get them into the program, we have to retain them and graduate them. Other areas of key concern. The first is care versus cure. There truly have been amazing scientific advances in such areas as cell regeneration or isolation of genetic markers for Alzheimer's or emergency room procedures in the first 24 hours after spinal cord injury. These are promising areas. These should be pursued. But for those currently living with disabilities, promotion of quality of life now is paramount. Research and funding in areas related to personal assistance services, assistive technology, supported living environments rather than nursing homes, job access, and economic policy is very directly related to the daily lives of people with disabilities. Second, disability and context. This is a theme that seems to come up over and over again in this conference in the last 2 days, which is that there's insufficient attention to the interplay and synergy of disability and gender, age, ethnicity, and or sexual orientation. Most of the work on African Americans and disabilities has come out of Howard University. There is a little bit of literature on Chinese and Chinese Americans with disabilities. Most of it is theoretical, not empirical. There's even less on Japanese Americans with disabilities, and there's almost nothing on other ethnicities. There is some notable research on women with disabilities and lesbians with disabilities. There is no article that I know of on gay men and disabilities. The third area is the area of abuse, and there are three key issues here. One is that the government puts the rate of abuse of children with disabilities as over 2 times as high as children without disabilities. But hard statistics are very hard to come by. We need better records of this. We need more information. Studies of the rates of abuse among people with disabilities have varied too tremendously. Secondly, there is no data on abuse as either the cause or the exacerbation of disability. In 2 of my students' dissertations, 10% of their physically and sensory disabled subjects had the onset or exacerbation of their disability due to abuse in the family. Third, within the area of abuse, we need better definitions of abuse to cover the kinds of situations that people with disabilities find themselves in. For example, a mother with a disability in a wheelchair went walking with her teenage son. They had a fight. The teenage son took the batteries out of the wheelchair and went home. Is this abuse? Fourth is the area of romance, dating, sex, pregnancy, and childbirth. There's only one study of marriage between an able-bodied partner and a person who already has a disability. One study, and it has an N of 8. There are more studies done on people who are married and then one of the partners acquires a disability, from which we learn that men are more likely to leave wives who acquire a disability than women are to leave a husband who has a disability. But we don't know much about the dating patterns of people with disabilities with able-bodied partners. There is only one book about pregnancy and birth for women with disabilities. That area leads us rather naturally to number 5, which is parenting. Through the Looking Glass, the agency that was mentioned where I work, is funded as a national resource center on parents with disabilities and has been a major contributor to the research and clinical work with parents with disabilities. Their groundbreaking work on assistive technology for parents who have moderate to severe disabilities on how to care for their babies has had tremendous impact on how the courts and social service agencies view the capabilities of parents with disabilities. But their research raises questions almost as fast as it answers them, and there is much to be explicated about the 10 million parents with disabilities. Thank you. Sixth is disability identity. How can parents teach a positive disability identity to their children with disabilities? Although we might hypothesize that disability identity and feeling a part of the disability community is a buffer against the stresses of being an oppressed minority, this actually has never been directly examined for people with disabilities. This research is a necessary precursor to creating a clinical model to implement this with families. And just as there are race-specific hassles, there are disability-specific hassles, and the impact of these on the day-to-day lives of people with disabilities is unknown. Seventh, assessment and diagnosis. For a discipline that encompasses the specialty of testing and assessment, there's remarkably little research outside rehab psych on the effects of specific disabilities on specific tests. Thus, persons with disabilities are administered tests without appropriate accommodations, with test items that reflect the sequela of disability, and results interpreted using norms of only able-bodied subjects. We need better methods of teasing out the presence of depression and anxiety from the physical and cognitive effects of a disability. We need norms for people with specific disabilities on common tests, and more information about disability-appropriate tests, testing accommodations, and interpretations. Lastly, the social model of disability in clinical practice. These 3 models that I've discussed, the moral model, the medical model, and the social model, have been used to describe disability and its status in society, but they've been predominantly theoretical. Rehab psych has slowly moved from the medical model towards the social model. Psychology in general has been even slower to embody this perspective. The integration of the social model into general clinical practice outside of rehab settings has not been well articulated, and actually was the impetus for my writing the book. I borrowed shamelessly from gay affirmative therapy and called the therapy that's based on the social model disability affirmative therapy. The relationship between the models families hold about disability and their psychosocial functioning is virtually unexplored, and ways in which the social model of disability should be reflected in training, in clinical programs, and in practice needs more elucidation. And then I have at the bottom of this page here, insert pithy conclusion here. This was supposed to occur to me this morning while I was in the shower. Instead, I will fall back on the fact that my time is up and leave a little time for some questions and discussion. Thank you.
We have time for just a couple of questions. If you'd come to the microphones in either of the aisles with your questions, please.
Good morning.
Good
I'm a
morning.
clinician in Dallas, Texas. I see a client who at times walks with a very wide gait. He has a degeneration of the cerebellum. I had him in a group with head injured clients. His issue is he sometimes is in a wheelchair, he sometimes walks. I notice that you can get out of your chair. He feels anger and a lot of shame in his group because people attack him because he's not really disabled because he can get out of his chair. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes. I have at various times in my life used a leg brace, crutches, and then starting when I had my children 12 years ago, scooter. There is a tremendous difference in being upright and seated. The minute you sit down, people treat you differently everywhere you go. The change in identity is profound. And I actually would probably not have initiated getting a scooter, but I went into work one day. I was then at Cal State Sacramento, and my employer said, "Oh, by the way, we bought you a scooter." So how could I say no? But there are issues within the disability community, about your ability to get up out of it compared to people who can't. There's issues outside of the disability community about your choice to sit and to be in the scooter. So you're very much caught between two worlds with different norms and different values, and you get ostracized in each. So I think that this is a difficult issue for people who go between different states of ambulation. Yes.
Hi, I have a hidden disability called fibromyalgia. I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with that term. You probably are. In any event, you might want to become aware of the Fibromyalgia Network, which is a wonderful resource for research. And they do research. For example, you just mentioned the ambulation, because some people with fibromyalgia are wheelchair bound. And there have been some studies done by the fibromyalgia folks on these very issues. And a lot of it actually has come out of the medical research, but it's been done with the support of psychologists because they recognize the dynamics between psychology and the physical body. So if you'd like that information, I'd be more than happy to give that to you. I'm just very impressed with the research, and I have a doctor who recognizes that without the psychological support, I would not be as well as I am. And that's really pretty much allowed me to come to this conference because I recognize my strengths so that I can get up and get on a plane and come here. So if you'd like that, I'd be more than happy to give that to you. It's a rich source of research.
Thank you. Yes, why don't you come up afterwards? And also, as you know, fibromyalgia is one of the difficult diagnoses because there are a lot of doctors who don't believe in it, so you get questioned for having symptoms. Do we have time for one more? Okay. Last one.
Thank you. Thank you for this very educational time this morning. I appreciate your comments about test construction and the lack of appropriate testing for, quote, disabled people, unquote. What I'm very concerned about is the issues of malingering. You know, some disabled people are viewed as malingering in their particular conditions, whether these conditions are acute, temporary, transient, or chronic. I'd like for you, if you can, to address some thoughts you may have on malingering and how that can be differentiated or detected or otherwise ruled out in certain types of disabilities. Mm-hmm. Your choice.
Okay. Just a little question, huh? There are obviously psychologists who specialize in disability assessments for disability compensation. And everybody who has a chronic disability has been somewhat tainted by the work that goes on in this area. That is, there's a degree of suspicion that accompanies all people with disabilities and the need to prove that you truly are disabled. And what happens at school, where I'm the faculty advisor to students with disabilities, is that they are afraid to come forward and say they are disabled, particularly if they had hidden disabilities, because they feel that people won't believe them. And in fact, we're going to ask them for proof of their disability. I am certainly by no means an expert in the assessment of disability and of trying to figure out malingering from non-malingering. What I can talk more about and can't do at the moment is just sort of the impact psychologically on the disability community of this key question, and the fact that most psychologists who see people with disabilities are doing it for this purpose, so that people in the disability community approach psychologists with a great degree of wariness. Because for psychologists, this has been the key question: are you malingering or not? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, but it's no fair. My people can't stand up.
The 2001 National Multicultural Conference and Summit presents the Dalmas A. Taylor Award for a light that shines eternally, taking on the challenge of change. Dr. Rhoda Olkin, in honor of your pioneering leadership, scholarship, and aggressive advocacy for the inclusions of persons of color in the central fabric of the mission of higher education, for the inclusion of people with disabilities, and within the field of psychology, presented at the second annual National Multicultural Conference and Summit here in Santa Barbara.
Thank you very much. I'm really deeply grateful for this.